can have a bit more of a deeper conversation about some of these aspects. So this online kōrero really revolves around this question of how do we support whānau in those first 2,000 days to help their children to thrive. We all know that early years, that early start time is just so crucial around just better outcomes for our tamariki, to help them thrive, to help them to be healthier, to make them more prosperous, across the whole of a lifetime. So how do we do that? What does that look like? We know that our mokopuna, they're not brought up in isolation. They're part of a whānau, they're part of a place where they live, their communities, they're part of health systems, education systems, they're impacted by policy and investment. There's a whole scheme of stuff that sits there. And often we hear about systems change in health or education. We hear about policy and investment. All of these things come to our attention when we're thinking about child well-being. But often the conversation that's missing from that is place. The place where these mokopuna live, the place where our tamariki and whānau live. That's often the missing part of the conversation. So Child-Rich Communities Kaupapa really is a movement to try and support more conversation, more understanding around how it is that we have these place-based movements, and we also have movement in investment and funding and health and education and all the other aspects of a child's life, and how we can bring those together, but guided by that place-based decision-making, guided by decision-making from whānau, from young people, from tamariki themselves. So here's our opportunity to do some deeper diving around what's happening in Aotearoa already, what's happening in your mahi, what's happening in motu generally, and also then to learn from Aimee. She's been overseas and has come back with a rich treasure pot full of all sorts of learnings just around this. How are they doing it over there? How do they bring in this collaborative infrastructure which supports tamariki in these first 2,000 days? What does that look like? How can we learn from that? What's happening here already? And how can we all together begin to influence some of those changes? So not much then for the next hour and a half. So just a really good opportunity for just a deeper exploration into all of this. And it's so timely, isn't it, at the moment, for us to really harness the power of communities and start to look at how we're going to start moving some of the decision-making back to whānau, back to tamariki, back to young people. So I'll give you a bit of background on Child-Rich Communities before it is that I pass you over to Aimee. Can you just set off the first slide, please, Nat? Thanks. So we're not starting from scratch here in Aotearoa. We already have some amazing things that are happening around the motu. We have communities who are already working in this way. They're working in a community-led development way. They've got their eyes fully on child well-being and youth well-being. And there's certain ways that they're doing that are affecting really positive change. So we don't have to start from scratch, as many of us know, but there is a place to be able to turn up the volume on that and look at how all of that work and that movement can start to weave into policy and investment, to other social structures, to program providers, to service providers. So Child-Rich Communities was born in 2014. And it came about as a result of a report called the Bright Spots Report. You can find that on our website if you're interested. And this was 21 communities around the motu who were all working in ways that were doing just exactly what we're talking about. So they were working in place-based, community-led ways. And when they did that, and then services and programs began to collaborate around that, then there was tremendous positive change, not just for those tamariki, but those whānau and the community as a whole. And so the golden nuggets that came from that came to form Child-Rich Communities, and there was a huge interest then in having a group of agencies really be able to harness that power and that knowledge and make that available to others. So that's pretty much what's been happening over the last 10 years with Child-Rich Communities in various forms. Next slide, please, Nat. So from child-rich communities, there's a couple of really key aspects. One is the ground of community-led development, and there's certain factors in community-led development that we know work well. So if you have a look at this diagram here, you can see the weavings and the threads, which is something about what I've already been talking about. Every child finds themselves obviously in a place. They're not isolated, and that's of course linked to whenua. Here in Aotearoa, we're privileged to be guided by Te Tiriti o Waitangi and Tangata Whenua, and that guides our mahi and how it is we can evolve this work for the benefit of all of our mokopuna. And then there's all of these weavings in between. And so often our focus can be on the weavings in between, you know, on local and central government, on residents, on funders, on academic aspects. The focus can just be on one of those threads. And what we know, of course, is that there needs to be all of this in the picture. However, what we want to see is all of this in the picture, but really driven by decision making that's at the front on the ground by whānau, by Tamariki, which is really focused on what's needed in those first 2,000 days especially, and then all of these other weavings pack around that. Next slide, please, Nat. So these 21 communities, they all had similar things that they did, and they were brought together under these core practices. And this is by no means a finished product. Child-rich communities, mahi has been influenced, of course, by communities and the work that they do, and we're in changing times and have been for a while. And so it's an ever-evolving feast. But what they found was that there were 7 key practices of engagement, which helped then to shift this emphasis into place-based community-led development for the benefit of our tamariki. So the first one was engagement. So really including families and whānau and the wider community into discussions and decision-making, just exactly what we've been talking about. Doesn't sound like rocket science, does it? But it's not usually something that is spearheading change within communities and within the child wellbeing system. Next one, empowerment. So not just seeing ourselves as program or service deliverers, but even if you are delivering a service or a program, to be able then to look around to see how is it that we can support the moimoia of whānau and the dreams of tamariki. How can we do that within the services that we are delivering? And how can we be more collaborative in a community setting as to how it is that we engage? Connections, well, whakawhanaungatanga is the glue, isn't it? And it's the really key aspect of a really well-functioning child wellbeing system. Next slide, please, Matt. Collaboration I already spoke to, and we've already looked at that last diagram, and so many of us know this, don't we? It's not new for us to think, oh yeah, we need collaboration in various ways. But often the missing piece around collaboration is community. Often the missing piece around collaboration is whānau and tamariki and rangatahi. We're very good at looking at how programs and service delivery, social services can collaborate, but then it's a very tunnel view. So how can we collaborate fully and holistically from that initial place-based view? Relationship focused, of course, responsive. So often we have an idea as to how things are going to be, but are we continually checking in with whānau and tamariki and changing our delivery, changing our funding, changing our investment, changing the thoughts that we had at the beginning as to what child wellbeing looked like, and really just listening to whānau in their place, listening to the needs of tamariki in their community and responding to that. And then finally, just remembering, as the weaving that we've just looked at has shown us, that we cannot do this alone. Just to concentrate on one aspect is not going to work, because children are not raised alone. They are woven into the threads of our communities. They're woven into the threads of life in so many ways. So this is really about shifting the power away from the back end of policy and investment and social service delivery and shifting it into the hands of whānau and of tamariki and rangatahi, and then letting that inform all the other aspects that are involved in a child's life. Sounds like perfect sense. And it's been shown again and again that it makes incredible difference to our families and our children when this does work, and yet we're still not quite there in doing this as a consistent rollout across the motu. So Aimee set off to the US with some of these pārtai, and a key one really for her was how is it that whānau can be supported in these first 2,000 days, how can whānau be supported to make sure that well-being of children is really crucial in all the aspects of a child's life. So I'm going to introduce Aimee and hand over to her now while we hear from some of the gold really that came from her trip over there. Aimee Hadrup is the Tamariki Wellbeing Manager at the Southern Institute, and had the amazing opportunity of going over to the US to study and have a deeper dive on all of these aspects. She's worked for a long time in this weaving together and these places of meeting of community and service provision and policy and investment. So it's really crucial work and investigation that she's done. So Aimee, kia ora, welcome. Thanks so much for coming along and being willing just to share some of your treasures from that and helping us to be able to explore this a little bit more this morning.
Ngā mihi, Louise, mō tō karakia I tēnei ata. Thank you so much for the invitation to come in kōrero today. And tēnei te tuku mihi kia koutou katoa. Just want to start with a huge mihi to everybody on the line today for all of the epic work that's happening across the motu, and really echo your comments, Louise, about just how much there is in terms of bright spots and amazing stuff happening in spite of the kind of system, as it were. So really excited to dive into the conversation today. Ko waio he hononga whakapapa oku ki ingarangi ki airahi anō hoki, engari ko Aotearoa taku whenua haumako, e te puaki au ki taupaki, I raro I ngā pariro manaki o te kawaro a maki rātou ko Ngāti Whātua ki Kaipara, e mihi ana ki a rātou. He tangata tiriti ahau, ko Aimee Hadrup tōku ingoa, nō reira tēnā koutou katoa. And another thing to say is I definitely don't have everything figured out around this very wicked kind of challenge that Louise has outlined, but I'm really pleased to be able to share some of the insights from my recent Harkness Fellowship, and really cool to have the opportunity to kōrero in the breakout groups, and excited to learn from all of you about what you've been kind of noticing around this challenge and how do we kind of collectivize on it.
Yeah, because this is a joined-up conversation, right? I mean, everyone who's on this call, I imagine, are experts in, their various pieces of mahi. And so this conversation can hopefully help us to pull out some threads, and with some extra learnings that you may have had, from what they're doing in the States as well. So tell us a bit about the mahi that you do with TSI.
Yeah, awesome. So, a bit of context just to kind of help you understand the kind of perspective that I'm kind of coming from in this conversation. So the Southern Initiative is a place-based initiative that was set up as part of the Auckland Plan. We're located inside of local government at Auckland Council, and really set up to try and disrupt the persistent kind of social and economic inequity for South Auckland, recognising that despite a lot of investment and a lot of things happening in our space, we're not seeing the kind of improvement in outcomes for whānau at the rate that we think is needed. And I guess a starting premise that if we want to see different outcomes, then we're going to have to all work differently together in order to achieve that. We have a really amazing team who are incredibly passionate about the power of whānau-led and Indigenous-led innovation, and I've had such a privileged time over the last 4.5 years to learn from my amazing colleagues in that space. We've had a focus on the early years since the inception of TSI. It was recognised early in the piece that that was a really critical lever if we're trying to improve equity and intergenerational wellbeing. So back in 2016, the team undertook what was called the Early Years Challenge. And this was a deep dive into the lived experiences of whānau raising tamariki in those first few years of life. At that time, we also drew really strongly on the neurodevelopmental science that was coming out, particularly the work of the Centre on the Developing Child at Harvard University, who had sort of looked at this rapidly exploding field of the science and tried to kind of synthesize that down into like, what does it mean for policy making? What do we do about all of this in-depth kind of understanding around how brains develop and how our biological systems develop and all of that sort of stuff. And one of the things that I think was really helpful about that work is it put a bit of a spotlight on stress and the role of stress in tamariki wellbeing, and particularly, you know, the for us in South Auckland, that cumulative persistent daily stress that many whānau are under. And I guess when we think about improving outcomes in the early years and the opportunity to really coalesce on, you know, how do we create the conditions for all children to have the best start in life, that kind of lens then brings into the picture all of the rest of government, probably. You know, like all of us have a role to play in supporting whānau at what is a critical time for our tamariki development, but also a really critical time for families, right? Like this is a big transition in people's lives, and the whānau that we work with had talked about, you know, being so motivated to make a really positive change and to heal for themselves and all kinds of beautiful stuff. And I think it's fair to say that in Aotearoa, this as a kind of policy issue hasn't really been coherently held particularly strongly. One of the things that we did in the Early Years Challenge was analysis of the growing up in New Zealand data, which really showed that for our kind of area of South Auckland, that kind of burden of compounding daily stress was really hitting our community hard, and that by age 2 you're already starting to see the impacts on child development and behaviour. And I guess a fundamental kind of driving thing for us that where you were born and where you're growing up shouldn't determine your life outcomes, and how do we work differently with particularly with central government to go, okay, there's a big gap here between what whānau are telling us makes the biggest difference for them and what we're investing in, and there's not really much of a mechanism for those things to kind of come together in a more coherent kind of a way. So over the last sort of 6 years, we've been working at, I guess, 2 levels of scale, working with whānau and our amazing community partners on the ground to try and explore what do the kind of compelling alternatives to what we have look like, and then working with our central government partners to support that kind of more whānau-centred, locally led practice, and try and reconfigure, like reverse engineer the way that we're working to be able to activate a kind of ecology of support, if you will, around whānau at this critical time. Not to say we've got it all figured out, but definitely some really deep learning over that period. So that's kind of what I went into the fellowship thinking about, and was really lucky to get that award. So Harkness Fellowships have been running since 1922, as it turns out, set up to strengthen ties between New Zealand and the States. They enable you to go to to America to do a project of your choosing for between 3 and 6 months, and they're super flexible. So I got to really shape this around all of the things that I wanted to nerd out about. And because we'd sort of drawn quite heavily on that work of the Centre on the Developing Child, I thought, be cool to go and loop back in with them and be able to share, you know, what have we been learning around the connections between this neurodevelopmental science stuff and mātauranga Māori and tūpuna parenting practices, and just, of course, like many other areas, that kind of increasing understanding that actually Indigenous wisdom had this stuff figured out. Mai rānō. And the developmental science is really just catching up. So that was a really cool opportunity to kind of connect with, you know, what most people would consider as like a leading light around the world of in the kind of academic space. And some of my colleagues were able to come over to Boston to share that experience, and amazing to have tangata whenua leadership beside me to be able to share some of that stuff. That was kind of a key part of it, but that bigger piece around, you know, how are they thinking about place-based approaches, and what can we learn? Like, what are they doing that's kind of similar to what we've been trying to do in South Auckland? And to be honest, I went into it not really sure, you know, what I would get out of it, and thought, well, it'll be a really epic experience regardless, right? To take my whānau over there and have a chance to sort of slow down and think about this stuff. But yeah, it really surprised me just how much I got out of it. Take a breath and let's get another question. Yeah.
And so much of what you were looking at over there was really based on this focus of, you know, the first 2,000 years, the early years, the importance of that as far as shaping the health and prosperity and resilience and well-being of our tamariki. And then also looking at how it is that place-based systems change could really affect some bigger movements, and how the US have been investing in that and what that looked like. So when you were thinking about, you know, place-based systems change, we hear those words a lot. Can you talk a little bit about what's meant about that, systems change and place-based?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess for me, when we think, like you said earlier, when we think about place, it's about thinking about tamariki in the context of their whānau, in the context of the community and the environments and the whenua in which they are growing up in. You know, the qualities and the conditions in which people live are not evenly or randomly distributed. We know that they're shaped by deeply rooted public policies, the social history, and in our case here in Aotearoa, the history of colonisation, structural racism, decades of failed social and economic policy, all of that. So I think for me, this kind of lens into this work is really critical, because it helps us to go, yes, programs and services are really important, and absolutely we need to keep a focus on ensuring that those things are at the level that they need to be. But we also need to be thinking about the whole system here. And I think it's fair to say, you know, the traditional kind of policy and investment kind of approach can really lead us down a track of just thinking about just like discrete programs and services. So how do we think about those things and systems, I guess? And that was the stuff that really, really blew my mind in terms of just the maturity of the field in the States, really. And there's a whole lot of reasons behind that. I was surprised that they're significantly far ahead of us, and this stuff has been happening for quite a long time. So some of the initiatives that I got to engage with, like, for example, the Harlem Children's Zone in New York City has been running for 30 years. You know, there's quite a lot of lot we can learn around how to keep this investment sustained over time, I think, because speaking for myself, and I'm sure that many others on the line will be feeling a similar way, like that frustration around the political flip-flopping that we have, and that kind of cycle of build it and then burn it. And, you know, our communities deserve better than that. So I guess I went into this, and it was just after the election that I left. It was in October, thinking, you know, what is it going to take for us to be able to have the enduring infrastructure so that communities can actually lead this stuff, so that we're not at the whim of decisions that are made in Wellington, or the kind of political cycle, which is a, you know, predictable pattern that keeps washing over us over time. Yeah, so I got to really shape this approach. I was really lucky to get linked up with an amazing woman called Joan Lombardi, who I've got a little blog post from her in the resources that we'll send around for you guys. And that really lays out the kind of the whakapapa of the emergence of a place-based approach in the States. And actually, I might just quickly share my screen, because I've got a little diagram from that article, which, oh, except for now I can't. Oh, come on, silly thing. Here it is. Yeah, which just kind of, I quite like this. She's sort of looked across all of the different. Can you see my screen okay, team?
Yep.
Yes, cool. All these different sort of versions of community-led systems approaches, and she's tried to articulate, like, what are the components of that. So Joan has worked in this field for decades. She was a chief advisor to 3 different presidential administrations on early years, and she's been a long-standing champion of community-led approaches. She's been behind a lot of what has been made possible across the state. So she's the little blog that I've linked here is definitely worth a read. But I guess when we look at this, it starts to bring into view the multiple and interconnecting systems that are in play when we're thinking about child wellbeing. Again, this is not completely new to us here in Aotearoa, but I think it's fair to say we just don't have that investment into the infrastructure that enables us to really look across all of these interconnected systems in place, and to start to kind of go, what are the bits that are needing some attention here? How do we reconfigure some of that? You know, what is the data telling us? What are families saying matters to them? How do we involve them in shaping a better kind of way here? Certainly, you know, when we think about neighbourhood conditions, local government has a really strong role to play. Auckland Council has a huge footprint of social infrastructure that at the moment, I would say, has not been really leveraged to its full potential around supporting child wellbeing outcomes and supporting whānau to be able to have places to go and connect with each other. And, you know, that piece around building social capital and having, you know, safe spaces is a really key thing that whānau tell us is important. So, yeah, I think that's kind of a good summary of kind of what we're sort of talking about when we're talking about a systems approach here. And then this is the other little diagram that's in that blog post, and really starts to name some of the components of the infrastructure that's needed to be able to take a community-led, systems-orientated approach to this stuff. Might look slightly different in our context, and certainly there's a real opportunity to think about, you know, what does a te tiriti-led approach that's really cooked into all of this look like? But yeah, I think this is a nice sort of a kind of sense checker for us about the kind of infrastructure that's needed to work in this way.
And we're all going to find ourselves in one of those in one of those circles, aren't we? Everyone on the call and everyone who's registered, we're all part of
Yeah.
that team in some form.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do we start to build the connections across those things and sort of, yeah, be able to coalesce and bring our collective effort to it. This terminology, early childhood systems building, was another one that I thought was really interesting and in really wide use over there. And, you know, just kind of making more visible the system work that's required, that at the moment just really isn't resourced. It's very hard, I think, for government and even for philanthropy actually to invest into this work. It can feel like it's, oh, you know, it doesn't lead you to tangible outcomes. But actually, if we're not thinking about the how do we improve the whole system, then we're missing really important opportunities for actually investing into the stuff that's going to make the biggest difference. And just to finish that little bit, and I'll turn my slides off, but this was just my kind of go at articulating what I saw in those 8 different place-based initiatives that I connected with, in terms of like what was common about them, or what was really helping them to be able to do what they're doing. So that backbone investment, and having the dedicated humans essentially who are waking up thinking about this stuff, who don't have the BAU of like delivering a service or, you know, all of that stuff. So having some dedicated folks in that, the investment into, you can call it field building or capability and capacity building, obviously inspiring communities and child rich communities doing heaps, key player in that space. It's not to say we don't have any of this infrastructure. I think we actually do have quite a lot, but we haven't necessarily thought about it as like a coherent kind of set of kind of resources, if you will, in regards to the early years system. So that's kind of an interesting proposition. Really strong stuff. I was quite surprised by this about growing the leadership of families and caregivers. So that like lived experience leadership was really, really strong in a number of these initiatives, and I'll spotlight one of those a little bit later. And then, you know, the governance arrangements for this stuff, I think we're kind of quite trapped in traditional modes of governance that really don't serve us when it comes to, you know, how do we really think about improving the whole system. And yeah, some really good clues, I think, in terms of what alternatives to that might look like. Yeah.
And so how, you know, there's all these different aspects, aren't there? And one key difference in this is that everybody's eyes are focused on the first 2000 years, and everyone's eyes are focused on place-based first, and then that informs their mahi. And so how did that happen? What did you see on the ground which made sure that really, that kaupapa stayed true all the time? You know, there's so much potential for drift here and there, or getting back into, you know, just blinders on, as far as, you know, well, we're just investment, we're just funding. How on the ground did things work out? How did all of these things start to weave into just this absolute focus on the first 2000 days, absolute focus on place-based being the thing that was going to inform everything else? What did that look like?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I was surprised at, and I think it's a legacy of this sort of the movement of collective impact in the States as well, that in many of the cases, people are quite kind of focused around, okay, the measures of early childhood development. So how are we tracking? How are our tamariki going in terms of some of these key developmental outcomes? I think that does help to kind of keep coherence around, you know, what is it that we're trying to do here? And certainly, you know, there was a lot of disruption due to COVID in terms of those outcomes, and I'm sure that's also the case here. In Aotearoa. I've got some examples, if maybe that might be
Yeah, that would be great.
a good thing to dive into next. So just, I guess, you know, like you said, it was a real treasure trove of like just an unbelievable amount of cool things that I got to have some exposure to while I was there. And so I'm just picking out three that I guess I think they help kind of, or I guess they've been things that I've been really percolating on coming back in and thinking about, we've got a new government and you've got to work with the government of the day. What's the opportunity here to really push the early childhood, early years kind of opportunity? And what are the things that we need to be really holding on to when the government's talking about a focus on the first 2,000 days, which it is at the moment. Surprisingly. So this first one is an initiative called United for Brownsville. This person that I'm hugging in the picture is a really amazing parent leader from this initiative, who I got to meet when I was lucky to get invited to a leadership council thing that they run. So it's all the agencies around the table and some of their whānau leaders as well that are involved in that. And the thing that she said to me, which I'll never forget, was my grandma always used to tell me, when you get a whole bunch of smart people in the room, common sense often walks out the door. And I think that really resonates for me in terms of, my background is in public health, and I've worked in different government agencies and done a lot of work in the kind of cross-agency space. And very often, when you've got a whole lot of government people in the room, that common sense, or the simple things that actually we need to be focused on, can disappear. And that's kind of in some ways a legacy of the siloing of government, and we come to it with our own particular view of what does the evidence say and what should we be doing here. And I think that and it definitely resonates with my experience in coming into TSI. Like, when you ground this stuff in the lived realities of community and of the people, it becomes a lot simpler and a lot more easy to wrangle, and a lot easier to know what is it that we need to be doing here. And United for Brownsville was definitely the initiative that had the most integrity, I think. Not that others didn't have integrity, but really strong accountability to what is it that the residents are telling us is actually important here, and how do we orientate everything around that. It was really, really impressive. So this is their little family advisory board. Advisory board sounds a little bit like it's a nice to have or something, but actually this group was really, really driving the effort, which was awesome to see, and all paid to be involved in this. It's an amazing, leadership development opportunity for local whānau, and just, really cool to be able to see that in action. Brownsville is a community in the depths of Brooklyn. It has the highest concentration of public housing in the entire United States, has massive social and economic challenges. And so what they've been able to really cultivate with this whānau-led approach has been really, really impressive. A couple of other ones I might just quickly whiz through here was, and this is a nice example of how the academic community can kind of bring its special superpowers to this kind of way of working as well. This is the UCLA Centre for Healthier Children, amazing group of people. And they've been doing this really cool work to basically overlay, I guess, the equivalent of, so it's called the Neighbourhood Equity Index. It's sort of a bit similar to NZ-DEP for people who are familiar with that, and overlaying that with child development outcomes in particular communities. So for this community that's on in the picture is Pomona, and basically by kind of overlaying those two data sets, they're able to identify where are the bright spots, where even though the equity kind of conditions are not great, this community is doing way better on child well-being than we would anticipate, what we would call positive deviance, right? Like, there's something that's working here. How do we understand that, and how do we grow it? And I loved that kind of taking a strengths-based approach to thinking about this stuff, to bring the discipline of the data and, you know, all of the nerdy stuff that the academic community can support with, but bringing that humbly to the table and working with local residents to go, okay, well, what do you think this means, and how do we support you to lead the system transformation effort? That was super cool. And my last little example, and the I will say that the photo is obviously in Wellington. So what was really cool is this is Colin Groth from Strive Together, which is an amazing national network of cradle to career community led initiatives. He had a sabbatical not long after I finished my fellowship, and he came out to Aotearoa. And so I got to give him a little bit of education on issues related to Te Tiriti, by taking him to Te Papa while he was here, and also got to set up some time with some officials and things to kind of pique their interest in what Strive Together has been doing and what we might be able to do here. So they're working with 70 different communities across the states, and really trying to support them with that kind of field building, so that they've open sourced a whole lot of systems capability building work on their website. Actually, you can sort of have a look around in there if that's something that you're interested in. They really support with the kind of, and don't expect anybody to be able to read this as tiny, but this is their kind of theory of action. It's a maturity framework. Again, that idea that if we're really paying attention to how our system is operating over time, we can demonstrate quantifiably how it's improving. And quite cool how they've because they have like a data role in each of the communities, and they come together as a network to land on, you know, what are the key indicators that we need to be tracking, and you know, for that to actually be determined by communities and not something that's imposed from on high as well, I thought was really, really cool. Yeah, that's just a little whiz through some cool bright spots.
Yeah, wow. So yeah, just being able to touch in with some of the on the groundwork and be able to meet some of those parents must have been amazing. So what did you then bring home with you? You know, what were some of the really key aspects that, you know, you thought, okay, there's all this stuff happening in the US. It's really amazing how they've shifted their focus to be able to really put community at the front, whānau at the front, and there's all sorts of aspects that they have built into that to make that work. Investment, ways of engaging with whānau, giving them leadership, you know, giving them a voice, giving them a place, and then also shifting their focus as to what's important and putting place-based at the top, and then everything else, you know, underneath. And so then you must have come back to Aotearoa with a whole bunch of really, you know, key things. What were those key things? And what's some of your whakaaro since then around how we can use some of those bits of gold to begin to make some shifts here? And, you know, a lot of the people who are on our online kōrero today, they might already be doing this, or they might just be at the edge of you know, moving more into community-led development, wanting to know more about how to strengthen those first 2,000 years. 2,000 days.
First 2,000 days for the next 2,000 years, if you will.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah, I mean, look, it was really, really useful. Like, there's something about being able to just step out of the daily kind of churn and having time to kind of decompress, to be able to see this work in a different context, and look, not all of it's relevant to us, and I would, you know, be the first person to say it's absolutely not about picking up anything from the States and dragging and dropping it into our context at all. Like, that is not something that I'm about, but what can we learn from another country that has been trying to do this stuff for a lot longer, and again, that piece around how things have been sustained over time. Like, my hypothesis is if we can actually get some sustained investment into that infrastructure, it almost becomes impossible to dial it back. You know, when you really unleash the power of community, and like there's no going back to being at the whim of, you know, policy decisions that are made very far away from our communities. So yeah, so key things that I've been thinking about is like, how the hell do we get more investment into that infrastructure in a sustained way, and in a way that builds on what we already have. And I do think there's an opportunity politically at the moment with a lot of talk about, you know, social investment and moving investment earlier in the life course. And, you know, when you look at those IDI analysis and all of that stuff, of course, it spotlights the time to invest for best effect is the early years, right? Like it makes so much sense on so many fronts, and yet we just haven't seen that investment into community-led efforts that is needed. So I do think that's important. I also think, and this is kind of key to the conversation, the breakout groups, is like we can't wait for government to get its act together. And that will probably never happen to the extent that all of us might like. So what can we do anyway? And Joan, who like I said was such a key person in terms of my fellowship, she said to me that our system here is broken. You know, it is absolutely broken, and it's just down to the strength of community leadership. That is why we've got these things that we've got here. And so yeah, I think how do we collectivize on this opportunity? How do we work smarter together? How do we build bridges across, you know, philanthropy, the academic community, to be able to kind of join up a bit more? That those are some of the kind of key things. I definitely think there's opportunities to be more smart about how we use data and evidence, and how do we bring that into community sense making. And really keeping that focus on being whānau led and creating the space and opportunities for whānau to be involved in what this looks like, because we're much more likely to do something that's of value if that's the case.
And you know, having forums like this and having you all join us like this, it really helps us to look in our own mahi, you know, where's the wiggle room? Often we get funding for a particular thing. It's not necessarily, you know, whānau led, it's not necessarily community led. And somehow we've got to find a little bit of wiggle room in there to start being advocates for this way of working, to start being advocates for maybe holding or investing ourselves within our mahi into this way of working, even if it's just moving slightly into some of those core practices of CRC, and how we're engaging, how we're hearing whānau voice, how we're thinking more holistically and more collaboratively, you know, down to community. Then, you know, we've all got this place, really. This is my feeling around being able to be advocates for the power of community-led, place-based, whānau-led, and the impact that that's going to have for our mokopuna, for, you know, especially those first 2,000 days, but just for the whole of a life course. And, you know, it's going to create all of us looking for that wiggle room, really, in our mahi, to see how can we affect some change.
Yeah,
Well, you know,
absolutely.
we could hear from you for hours, I'm sure, Aimee. And she's given us some links to some other papers and some more of her mahi that will go out on the email to you all afterwards. But it is really important for us to be able to hear from each other and just to have a deeper dive on some of this too. So in a moment, we're going to flick into the breakout rooms. And there's a couple of partai that we're going to be talking about. Do you want to just put that up, Nat? So this is our opportunity to see who else is here, to hear from you all about what mahi that you're all doing currently. So use a bit of that time to introduce yourself and introduce your mahi. And then if you can appoint one person in your group to just take some notes. And when we come back, we'll ask that person either to kōrero or to put some of that information in the chat. Also, if you have questions for Aimee right now, write them down, hold that thought. And when we come back again, you'll have the opportunity to ask Aimee some of those questions. So the first thing to discuss in your breakout rooms, what is needed to grow community-led system change approaches to child wellbeing in Aotearoa, which closes the gap between community knowledge and policy or funding decisions. So that's the first one. You're going to have about 15, 20 minutes. So allocate your time between these two questions and we'll just give you a prod when it's time to move on to the next. In your mahi, where can you start to bring together a place-based community-led development focus with early years to ensure tamariki get a great start to life? So that's, again, thinking about, the wiggle room that we all have, even in a tight system. And so many of us are working within this really tight system, whether it's driven by funding or policy, or just what it is that we have to meet when we show up every day. But somewhere in there, there's a piece of wiggle room. And if we're really able to see the positive change that working in this way brings and have faith and trust in that, then we can all become advocates for doing more of this within Aotearoa. All right, so we're going to send you all off into breakout rooms. Sometimes what happens is you get put into a breakout room and we realize there's only 2 of you left in there. So we quickly pick you up and put you in with somebody else. So if that happens, just hang on tight and eventually you'll land in a group somewhere. And then we'll just give you a notice, a couple of minutes before it is that you're due to come back. All right, Nat, if you could send everybody off, we'll see you in a little while.
Aimee, did you want to join a room?
Yes, if you can put Aimee in a room, I'll answer for her. Yeah, we already talked about that. That'd be great.
Oh,
I didn't realise I was on mute. Apologies.
I'm going to put you and just looking who's actually gone into rooms. Give me a sec. I've got 4 in there, 3 in there, 3 in there, 4 in there.
We still have some people who are left waiting to be allocated.
Only people I have not allocated are you and Aimee.
There we go. Yeah.
Just Aimee, have you got a did you get a thing come up?
Should I just join room 1?
Yeah, sorry,
Great.
I thought
Cool.
I've signed you now, so
Awesome. Thank you. See you in a bit.
cool. And I'm gonna stop the share, and I'm gonna pause the video, and try and remind me to
This is our opportunity to hear back from you all, because we'd really like to hear what it is that you've been talking about and have this time. We've only got a short period of time, but have this time to just co-learn really from each other. So if I could have some volunteers, that would be amazing. So yeah, just maybe one person from a couple of rooms able to have a kōrero, and everybody else put some details in the chat. Is there anyone who's willing to go first, just summarising some of the things that you talked about? Kia ora, Dom, ngā mihi nui.
Kia ora, I'll do my best. It was sort of wide-ranging, varied conversation, but I'll try and say a few things. So just generally, I suppose we talked about, in terms of family and sexual violence prevention, that totality informed models can help us know what to do, and they can help ensure that people who work in this space in government agencies and other organisations can be on the same page, so we know which parts of the system that we're working on and have a shared mental model of how we're working. Talked about the importance of working with whānau and making sure that we collect and listen to whānau voice, and that evidence, especially in that format's a critical driver to make things happen, and that systems barriers can fall away when staff of agencies and organisations hear about real needs, and not just having the usual people in rooms who are making decisions, to have community and whānau represented. Systems are people and systems are whānau was one quote we had. There's an importance of lived experience and lived reality, and that the whānau voice brings clarity. We talked about educating parents and giving them the information they need to be able to to provide the things that are needed for their whānau, working with parents, especially in the early years, as Aimee talked about. In terms of organisations and places to access that could be done through ECE and early learning services, and using lived experience in those situations to close the gaps. And then for the second question, we touched on working with flexible relational contracts and commissioning relational ways of working rather than tightly bound contracts to allow people to work in their roles in flexible, meaningful ways rather than ticking boxes. Talked about community mobilisation a little bit, and how we can frame that up for communities so that the mahi can be done. Children are a great motivator for change, and that people will change more for their tamariki and mokopuna than themselves, and that there's a balance between we just got thrown out of the room with this last point, but there's a balance between advocacy and being on the ground. So that's where we got to.
Wow, juicy stuff. Great. Yeah, neat. Really fruitful conversations. Thanks, Dom. Someone from another group?
I can go.
Oh,
yeah, I really enjoyed meeting everyone in our group, and I could have chatted to them for ages. So we had quite different perspectives. So Bella was sort of talking about her community-based projects, which are backed by Te Whatu Ora and kind of really driven by the paediatricians, and sort of talking about how when you've got Te Whatu Ora behind you, but they're kind of giving you space to do the work that you want to do, like having the big organizations just on board to let you kind of run with it is really positive. Where Ali was talking about working in an ECE and doing like really amazing stuff. I wanted to pick her brains forever. But saying about how, you know, it's these policy reviews that now they're having to spend all this time talking about health and safety stuff, and just sort of talking about how it would be good to have the people who are making these policies actually understand what's going on in these communities, because sometimes these policies, while they might be valuable, but they're working against what's happening in terms of sometimes actually working against the work, but sometimes just taking up time that could be going to the work. So yeah, there was a bit of chat about that. And then in terms of the community-led focus, again, Bella was just talking about, like, if you can get the big organizations on board, that can really help. Like if they're on board with the community-led focus, then that can kind of empower people to do that kind of work. And I was talking about how in our program of training up speech language therapy students, we model a lot of community-based initiatives, and with a view to hopefully the speech language therapy students coming away with perspectives of different ways of doing speech language therapy that's not just that sort of traditional kind of pull-out model, but actually seeing different ways, so that then as they get more experience, they can sort of branch out and kind of do things in different ways. So kind of a more long-term approach to how speech language therapy will be done and in the communities. So yeah, that was us.
kia ora, Bianca. Yeah, and just flavouring all of our mahi with these aspects of community-led development and aspects of whānau voice, and, you know, how we individually and collectively can start to, you know, bring that to the very front of our mahi. Sounds like you wore that little groove around pretty well. And there is your opportunity now as well. You know, if you want to continue to connect with others, or you've seen somebody in the chat in their initial intro, you want to just contact them, just flip them a personal message in the chat before we close off. So just one more person from another room, please.
Is this okay, team?
Oh, kia ora. I can hear you, but I cannot see you.
Kia ora. This is Kimmy, and I was part of the Jared, Bridget, and Kieran team.
Kia ora, Kimmy.
Kia ora. Hi, Dom. Also, Dom's my boss. Nice to see you, Dom. Anyway, yeah, we had a really good chat. We've got different experiences and come from different backgrounds, which is cool. Around the first one, we sort of got stuck on that one because that was, you know, so many things that we were keen to talk about. But some of the ideas we had were around, I guess it's that reverse engineering that Aimee's talking about, and the closing the gap between community and whānau knowledge and priority versus, you know, sort of what's being told from policy or funding or government. One thing is around the, I guess, re-identifying, reframing what the problem is that problem identification, and it's never strength-based either. It's you know, you've got to look at needs and aspirations, but also often we will pick things that aren't actually the problem. It's a manifestation of much deeper things around social determinants and things, and that was really important if we could think about the reframing of that to bring that knowledge closer together so that we're in the right direction. Alongside that, we also thought about highlighting the evidence of the current work that is happening in communities that is community-led and is often not funded, or even not funded through the NGOs, but they will do a contract but then do the work that they know really makes a difference, usually with no funding at all. So about supporting that invisible work and really evidencing and lifting up that mahi to say, hey, remember when you guys said this policy was the most important thing, or this kaupapa was the thing that this community needed? Here's the evidence to tell you it actually wasn't, and this is what shifted, this is what's made the difference, which isn't, and try to bring that sort of like, you know, using that academic evidence stuff to try to pull it back through, so that there's a closer, you know, connection between what's important to whānau and community and what can actually be achieved there in place with their knowledge and their lived experience. Funding what they say matters, not what the policy or the funders say is. So it's kind of like in an ideal world, and you know, it's hard to do small changes across agencies, but it would be that complete flip of power dynamics and that mindset of that whānau are actually the experts in the room, not us as government people that are trying to like get these things done for our ministers, etc. We talked a lot about how important whānau voice was and how can we actually do that well and meaningful, in a meaningful way that feeds back into what whānau tell us matter. But yeah, I guess those were the two things: the problem identification as a starting point, could be more strength-based, could be a more healing point, but also coming back to like celebrating who they are and what they know already and what they've already done for years and years, and how that hasn't been supported and the good change that's made. Is that okay, team?
Kia ora, thanks, Kimmy. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and just bringing it back, it sounds like you've all had this kōrero as part of your groups, just bringing it back again to, you know, where's your wiggle room in the mahi that you've got, talking about how to lift the volume a little bit on stories and hearing about what's happening in community already. Inspiring communities do a lot in that place, as do child-rich communities, but we've all got places where we can start to really lift this kaupapa as a means to increase child wellbeing. So any final questions for Aimee? Does anyone have a question for Aimee before we start to close? Just pop your hand up if you do. All right, well, I'll hand over to Aimee now too, because yeah, I've got a bit of a partai for you, Aimee. So
just when I thought I was off the hook.
Not yet. So, you know, based on all of these, the kōrero that you've heard and some of the feedback, and weaving that into, you know, some of the gold that you brought back from the US and some of your whakaaro around how to weave that in, what's, you know, one most important thing that feel that, you know, it's useful to focus on to move this kaupapa forward? And I'm really pinning you down to one thing. It's really tough, I imagine, but what would be good?
My one thing is, how do we really lean into helping our system to work differently to better enable communities to do this stuff? So I think we talked in our group about how the way that government contracts and the kind of the way that the public management system operates is really holding the status quo in place. So yes, community-led innovation, yes, whānau-led innovation, also system innovation. You know, how do we lean into and hold government's feet to the flames around, you know, powering up communities, all of these things that we're hearing a lot about. Let's help them put their money where their mouth is. and as Kimmy said, you know, what's the problem definition? What's the opportunity here? And how do we sort of demonstrate what good can look like? I think there's lots of opportunity to collective eyes on that, and very keen to keep talking with whoever's up for kind of leaning into that challenge.
Well, kia ora, thanks Aimee for being willing to come on and share some of your whakaaro and your experience to help this kaupapa. And to you all, there's so many online offerings that you could click onto, and to click and then show up is also not necessarily easeful. So thank you for coming and being willing to engage in this deeper exploration for the benefit of our tamariki, our rangatahi mokopuna, our whānau and communities. I'll close off with karakia. You will have an email following up with the survey link. It's really useful if we can get some feedback from you, and also with some links from Aimee giving a bit more detail about her mahi. So I'll close up with karakia. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa pauna mu te moana. Hei huarahi mā tātou e te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai. Tātou ia tātou katoa. Haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Kia ora whānau, kia pai tōra. Have a great day. Really lovely to connect in with you. Ka kite.
Ngā mihi.